Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. We've been going through some prophecies and lots of Dead Sea Scrolls, and I've always tried to pull in the church fathers too, because the Dead Sea Scrolls show you what's going on right before the New Testament, and then we have the New Testament itself, and then the early church fathers are the disciples of the apostles. So, what happened right after the New Testament? And when you see a consistency in all of them, that's really fantastic. And it shows you your doctrine is correct and nothing's been changed. And it really helps in a lot of that. So, one of the things we've been doing as far as church history goes, what you want to do is first start with something like Eusebius. So, church history in general, lots of things happened. There was one guy who put together church history as far as like trying to make a whole book or a series of books, and that was Eusebius in the year 325. He was at the Council of Nicaea, so a lot of church father records are from Christ to 325. That's called the ante-Nicene period or the before Nicene. And then there's the Nicene stuff with the Creed that year. And then there's the post Nicene stuff, which is from 325 all the way up to 6 or 800. And I've never studied the post Nicene stuff very well. In the books, you'll find Eusebius is the very first book in that set. But what Eusebius did is wanted to pull together a general history of everything. So for Josephus, for instance, is a really good general history over the time period of the Old Testament. Eusebius is a general good history for the New Testament, and he will tell you what books still exist, quote lots of things in them. So we've put together, we're in the process of doing a fresh English translation, but you can get Eusebius just about everywhere. Um, so we're working on book three. We're almost got that completed. And just to remind you, some of the things, book one, for instance, tells you a lot about the things about the Lord and about the Bible, like the alleged discrepancies between of Jesus' genealogy between Matthew and Luke, and how to fix those. What actually is going on there? There's a letter that King Abgar wrote to Jesus, and Jesus' reply is recorded in book one. Book two talks about a lot of different things that are really interesting, some of which are the therapeutic, which, when you look at their connection with the Essenes down in Egypt, it looks like they're basically the same. So when the Essenes became Christian. So it's really, really interesting, gives us a lot of details about their history and the books that they used in the library of the School of the Prophets. So in book three, though, what we're looking at, there's some interesting things, and I put that on the title. For instance, did Paul have a wife? Is there any record of that kind of thing? Premillennialism, things like that. And I just found some really interesting things, and we're not going to go over all of them, but just two or three in here. But this is book three, the one I've been working on, so it's not completely perfect yet. There's probably typos and stuff in it, but basically, he starts out and it's got 39 chapters. It starts out in the first one where the apostles preached, like Thomas was in Parthia, Andrew in Scythia, John in Asia, buried in Ephesus, things like that that we already know about, and Paul and stuff like that. And then chapter two talks about Linus being the first bishop. And I thought that was interesting because we got Catholics saying that Peter was the first bishop, but the early church fathers consistently say Linus was the first, then Anacletus, then Clement, then, on down the road. So very interesting. And he refers to things in Scripture. The different epistles that are written by some of the disciples and some that are forged. So basically, we're going to get to this in a little bit, but they talk about a genuine book. So a genuine book, for instance, would be something written by Peter or Paul, the ones we're thinking of, and those should be placed in the canon. If there's another Peter or another Paul, which I'm sure there's lots of them, that are early church fathers that wrote, then there might be some dispute. Is this actually the Paul of the New Testament, or is this a different Paul? If it's a different Paul that's not an eyewitness, his book doesn't belong in the canon. If it is Paul, then it does. And so some of the disputed books are just disputed because they're not sure if it's the same John that wrote the book of Revelation, the Gospel of John that wrote this, or is it a different John? And there's a lot of discussion in here about that, and they go back and show you the histories for those things. So it's pretty interesting. And then usually for the fake stuff, a lot of times they'll stop and tell you, we know this is written supposedly by Peter, but we know the guy who did it, he's part of this cult. It was written at this time period to try to make people believe this. So they're very thorough in a lot of that kind of stuff. So the successors of the very first apostles were Peter, and then Timothy, is the first pastor of the church in Ephesus. We have that in in the Bible. Titus was over Crete. Luke, what he did. Crescens, Linus, Clement, Dionysius the Areopagite. That's pretty interesting too. This is in Acts chapter 17. Paul talks about when he was preaching in Athens. One of the first converts, I think there's 3 converts listed in Acts 17, but one of them is this guy, Dionysius, and he ends up becoming the first pastor in Athens. And actually, he writes something, so it's pretty cool. I don't know if it exists or not, but this is the kind of information that we are looking for. And so, if there's a fake book with his name on it and how to tell the difference, things like that is what we want to know. About the siege of Jerusalem and the people, the things that happened there. We'll skip over that for now. The famine, and then lots of stuff in here. Predictions of Christ about what happened in 70 AD. Signs that preceded the war. Lots of interesting signs, supernatural signs. It's interesting to me that when you look at this and know that God is consistent, if the end times were starting, there should be certain signs. And maybe the signs are there and it's not actually starting because there's always wars and rumors of wars, but there's certain things that you look for. And so when you go to a church that doesn't even bother looking, doesn't even bother knowing what to look for, that's a problem. Just like if you went to a church and they didn't bother talking about sins or repentance or anything, or didn't help people, that would be a problem. And according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, all those things are equally important. You want a moral church, one that teaches, one that corrects, one that does these kind of things that are concerned about the people and truth. And then also in a spirit of gentleness, but then also the prophecy, because that's very important too. So lots of things happen there. And then about Josephus and his work. So they talk about who Josephus was, things like that. What Josephus says are the Jewish old books, and it's the same thing as the 39 books that we have in the Old Testament. So that's pretty cool. And then he says there's lots of other books, but they're not to be put together in that sense because the 39 books of the Old Testament were given to us and dictated and put together by prophets. Other people were just historians, so they may or may not be even 100% correct. It's just a history book, so it's not on par with Scripture. And then it talks about Simeon was the second bishop of Jerusalem. So the first one is James, and we see that in book 2 of this. He tells you all about the circumstances surrounding James, who he was, how he died, what happened, and things like that. And then Anacletus becomes the second bishop of Rome. And then Clement becomes the third, and then the bishops of Alexandria. The Epistle of Clement. And this is interesting because the Epistle of Clement is genuine. And by that, we mean they know because people way back when quoted it. So they know Clement wrote an epistle, and it's called First Clement. That does not mean it's supposed to be in the canon because Clement is not an eyewitness of our Lord. He studied under Peter, according to what he said. So interesting that. So a genuine thing is something that's written by that person. Question is the Clement we're talking about the same Clement, that kind of thing. So there's really good books they would highly recommend that you read, but they don't want to put it in the canon for that reason. And number one, we want to concentrate and know very, very well the 27 books of the New Testament. That's where our heart is. But then these guys will explain a little bit of what happened later. So, first epistle of Clement, for instance, he's writing to Corinth. And First and Second Corinthians in the Bible, yeah, they still at it, still messing up. So he has to write them an epistle. The different persecutions, the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, some people accept it and some don't. Again, the reason is not because they don't think it's a prophecy, but was it John the Apostle that wrote it or some other John? And we'll see in a little bit why there's a little bit of confusion to it. But it's obvious 99% of all the churches accepted it as genuine, and it's in our canon today. So different relatives of the Savior, bishops, more bishops. Some really interesting stories about John the Apostle when he was in old age. Basically, the general history is that he's exiled because of the persecution of Domitian, which was just in the year 96 AD. He persecuted a lot of people in ways that he shouldn't have, not just Christians. And they basically had him assassinated and all his stuff undone. And everybody that he didn't like, they just let them go. It was a really weird situation. And so, but that afforded John the Apostle to be on the island of Patmos by himself, away from everybody. And he saw the book of Revelation and wrote it down. So, lots of information about that. The order of the Gospels. Let me make sure I've got the right thing set up here. Okay, 30 is the first one we want to look at, or 25. This is the different order of the Gospels. The fact that we've got 4 Gospels, 1 book of Acts, 14 epistles of Paul, and then the general epistles. Excuse me. And I want to stop here and just look at this. This is our first one we really want to look at today, chapter 25, the real and fake apostolic works. And this is kind of important because he says, first off, there are 4 holy gospels. Of course, we know those to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew wrote Matthew, John wrote John, Mark wrote the book of Mark based on what Peter told him. So it's actually Peter's gospel. And then Luke wrote what Paul basically told him and other people he interviewed. And so it's really Luke's gospel. So it's those 4. And then the book of the Acts of the Apostles, same one that we have. After these are the epistles of Paul, and then First John and First Peter. And it will explain why he's doing this here in a minute. The last book is the Revelation of John. So the book of Revelation, concerning which we'll give different opinions in due time. But these are all acknowledged as genuine. Okay. So we know that John wrote First John and Peter wrote First Peter. And we know the same John wrote the book of Revelation, or at least one of the Johns did. It's a real book, something that we really, really need to read. And of course, we all believe it was John, and he mentions that here in a little bit. The disputed books are accepted by the majority. There are James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. Some simply question whether they're written by apostles or other people with the same names. For instance, in another place in here, he talks about John is buried in Ephesus because that was his headquarters for planting churches after he came back from the Isle of Patmos. So basically what happens, you've got Timothy and then other people running the church, and he just hangs out there and he's the local missionary or apostle. Kind of like me, I run this and this is my ministry. I go to Calvary Chapel, Johnson County. There's a pastor there. I don't pastor it. I'm just, there. I do have a Bible study on Tuesday nights associated with the church, but other than that, it's not mine. I'm just there. So John is there as a church planning person. So anyway, James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, whether they're the right people or not. But the vast majority of the churches have always accepted those books. It's just because people get confused. And we'll see how they got confused here in a minute. The rejected books are the Acts of Paul, Shepherd of Hermaeus. In another place, one of the church fathers says that the Shepherd of Hermaeus, probably a good book to read, but it was written by um, a bishop in like a 50 to 100 years after the time of the apostles. So again, it might be a good thing to read, but it should not be in the canon. And some canons, Greek texts will have it in the canon, so you have that sometimes. And then there's an Apocalypse of Peter. So those are disputed or rejected rather. Now, this is how we kind of learn what we're talking about. Additional disputed books are the Epistle of Barnabas. So some like it and other people don't like it. Some people put it in their canon, others don't. And the so-called teaching of the apostles. So the simplest form of that is the Didache. So basically, there's this document called the Didache, which is a group of pastors in the first century. It's dated somewhere between 50 to 100 AD. So John is still alive when this is written. So no question about it. But basically, and it's a really good text. It actually teaches premillennialism and several other things. Actually teaches a pre-trib rapture if you read it carefully. And you see that by my teaching, Lee Brainerd, several other guys have talked about it. Anyway, a first century document. So that's pretty cool. Uh, and then, but notice what it says here. These two, the Epistle of Barnabas and the teaching of the 12 apostles, or the Didache actually, are grouped with the revelation of John. Now that's a pretty high place to be. These books being grouped with the book of Revelation, which I have said some reject and others accept as genuine. Some also place the gospel of the Hebrews in this category. Hebrews who have accepted Christ are thoroughly delighted with it. These are the only disputed books. So, what are we talking about here is this kind of disputed books? Well, what's interesting is, first off, we have the Didache, which everyone understands is not to be added to the canon because we don't know that it was written by any of the apostles. But it's really good information, really good practice. People that were the disciples of the apostles put together, this is what we're going to do in our churches to safeguard against heresy, abuse, things like that. You probably in your church have some sort of a policy about making sure the kids are safe, locked doors, just different things. And whatever you guys do is probably something I ought to pay attention to if I started a church. Probably 99% of it would be something I would want to do also. So it's just good practical information. But what's going to happen is somebody's going to take the Didache and add to it and pretend like the 12 apostles said stuff and add to it and expand it. Now, it's obvious when you get to it that that part is fiction. It's really obvious. Later on, though, that will be the basis for the apostolic constitutions, which is people adding even more to it. And I think there's 7 different ones of those. About one every century, somebody adds to it and comes up with something. So you can kind of see why that would be disputed. So the teaching of the 12 apostles and the apostolic constitutions has some good stuff in it, but it's got a lot of junk. It's all based on this, which is real. Now, that being said, this is interesting here, the gospel of the Hebrews. So, what is that? Well, according to the church fathers, Matthew wrote the book, the Gospel of Matthew, in Hebrew or probably Aramaic. It says it's a Hebrew dialect. So, Hebrew or Aramaic or something like that. And then it was translated into Greek. We have the translation into Greek. Now, with that in mind, most of you know about how when you look at the Passover Seder, you see the Messiah in it. If you could read Hebrew and you read the New Testament in Hebrew, all sorts of things would pop out at you. Now, it's not super necessary you do, but it just makes it more alive. It's like reading this stuff. It's not super necessary we know anything about church history, but it does answer some interesting questions. So people that read Hebrew will look at this and go, oh, this is the one I want to read more than Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But see, what happens later is that there is a Ebionite, well, there's a group of people called Ebionites that were founded by a guy named Ebion, who was a Pharisee, or Sadducee rather. And then there was a guy named Cerinthus. They came together and created the Gospel of the Ebionites, which is another name for this Gospel of the Hebrews. So, in other words, there's a Gospel of the Hebrews that is actually just a Hebrew version of Matthew. And that would be great to have. Then there's a Gnostic, cut up, tampered version of the Hebrew version of Matthew by the same name. And that's what's confusing at first, because you'll go through the church fathers and they'll talk about how great the Gospel of Hebrews is. And then the next breath they'll say, like, oh, that Gospel of Hebrews, that's trash. They're talking about two separate books that happen to have the same name. And this is done by design. The cults are trying to confuse and get their stuff out. For instance, we like the book of Revelation. Another reason why, the reason why it's disputed, and he tells you in here, and it's in other places. Cerinthus, that same guy, wrote a book of prophecy. It's totally wacky, but he calls it the book of Revelations. And at first, the first version of it, he put John's name to it. So this is the second book of Revelations written by the Apostle John, and to get his work out there. So you can see why, if there's a real Gospel of a book of Revelation by John and a fake one, and people don't know that, and you pick the fake one up and you read it and you say, this is garbage. Why would anybody read this in their church? That's what's going on. So it's the same thing here. No one would want to read, and if you read it once, you'd be, oh, this is obvious. We don't want to read the teaching of the 12 apostles in church. Now, the Didache, that would be very, very good to read, even in church. The Gospel of the Hebrews, it's just a Hebrew version of Matthew. So we already got Matthew. So we read Matthew in church all the time. You guys don't read Hebrew, so it would be pointless to do. You don't read Greek either, probably. So just the English version. So same thing. But now the Gospel of Hebrews by the Ebionites, that's trash. We don't want that. So the Epistle of Barnabas, too, same kind of thing. This one was disputed. Is it the Barnabas, the companion of Paul, or is it a different Barnabas? And it doesn't really matter, because Barnabas wasn't one of the 12. He was one of the 70. So anything Barnabas wrote, we wouldn't put in the canon anyway, because he's not an eyewitness of Jesus. He's an eyewitness of the apostles. So it would go into this secondary situation. So let me explain up here, for instance, the Acts of Paul. The Acts of Paul, if you break it up, are created out of two things. There's 3rd Corinthians, which we have today in the Armenian canon. We've published that. That seems to be legit. Everybody says it's legit from way back when. But there's also this book called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is obviously either tampered with or just total fiction. And whoever wrote that took those two and put it together and said it's the Acts of Paul. And so you're going to see that a lot. There's another work called The Ascension of Isaiah, gives it the same exact thing. It's 3 pieces. The first piece is a history of how the prophet Isaiah died. And it's just history. It's rock solid, mentioned many other places. So that's cool. And then there is a prophecy by a church father named Isaiah, which is a very good prophecy for us to know about. Has to deal with end time prophecy. So that's cool. So they took these two, and in the middle of the two, they put their wacky doctrine. So when you look at this, you can tell, obviously the church father Isaiah that knew the apostles is not the Isaiah that died and got martyred, sawn in half in a log. So it's obvious that it's two things put together, you know. So it's interesting how they go to great lengths to do this, but they mess it up so bad. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. So there's some things that are real, some things that are fake. This piece right here I thought was amazing, just to look at this. So the concept is everybody back then accepted the Didache not as scripture, but as genuine church history, eyewitnesses of the apostles, and something that we should pay attention to in our church. Same with the Epistle of Barnabas. Same with the Gospel of the Hebrews, the original one, but not the ones that are messed up. Not the teaching of the apostles, not the Gnostic version of the book of Hebrews or the Hebrew Gospel, and not the Cerinthus weird version of Revelation, but the real one that John wrote. So very, very interesting. So this pretty much goes together. I just thought it was really interesting that they would take the Didache, Barnabas, and Revelation and the Gospel of the Hebrews and lump them together. That to me was fascinating information. So, okay, and then there's heretical books. For instance, the Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Matthias, and there's many, Gospel of Mary, all those kind of things. Those are all fake. And so we're told, as far as Gospels go, there's only four, always have been only four, and always will be only four. So now that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't have said, I remember something because I was there, and then added to it or whatever, but I want to be careful with that. And then some of the Gnostics, Menander the sorcerer, how he got started, the Ebionite heresy we were talking about, Cerinthus, the things that he did. And this is about John and what he did. The Nicolaitans, who they are, what they did, and the Matthians kind of go along with that. Now, this is where I want to get to for tonight. This is the next thing. The apostles who were married. So up here, he's talking about the Nicolaitans. And one of the things that they did is they practiced fornication. They said it was okay. And there's a big explanation of how it got started and why and that kind of stuff. But he covers that issue, okay, and then says, now, because of that, some people are saying if you really want to be holy, you'll be celibate and not get married. So kind of flipping to the other side. So he's trying to say, okay, no, do you know that there were apostles that were married and they're okay. So it's okay to get married and have a relationship. It's not okay to have a sexual relationship if you're not married. Just basic morality. Okay. And so these guys took it to one extreme. Now some people are trying to go the other direction. And he says, after the above quote, Clement continued, stating which apostles were married in a rebuttal to those who rejected marriage. So, for this reason. But now look at this. This is really interesting. He said, and here's a quote from Clement of Alexandria. This is closer to 200. But remember, he's writing this in 325. So, in his Stramata 3:6, if you want to look that up, he says, or will they reject even the apostles? For Peter and Philip had children. Philip also gave his daughters in marriage. And Paul did not hesitate. This is the interesting part, this one right here. Paul did not hesitate in one of his epistles to greet his wife, whom he did not take with him for the sake of his ministry. Now, Origen actually says something very similar to this too, so we have some corroboration. But when I first read this, I'm thinking like, what, an extra biblical epistle? Because I don't remember that in the Bible anywhere. Well, it turns out it actually is in the Bible, and Origen references it. Well, let me bring that up real quick so we can see. And this is in, should have had this ready before, Philippians chapter 4. Most of you remember Philippians chapter 4. They have this problem with two ladies called Eusebius and Syntyche, and they have a problem. Now, if you go to church history, Clement of Alexandria explains what happened. Their husbands were deacons, and the deacons were giving food to people and making sure everything works out right. Persecution comes, and the two deacons are executed. So Syntyche and Eusebius decide they're going to pick up the situation and continue the work of their husbands. But for some reason, these two girls don't get along. And we don't know specifically what it is. One wanted to run the ministry one way, one wanted to run the ministry the other way. They both thought that they should be the head, and there's just some sort of pride or something there. So anyway, so he's saying these ladies have a good heart. They just have a problem. They're not very mature. So can someone come alongside him and fix the problem? So he says, I beseech Eutychus and Syntyche that they have the same mind in the Lord. You need to get mature and think about what the Lord wants, not from you, but from this ministry. I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help those women which labored with me in the gospel. So these two women helped Paul. They also helped Clement and several other people do things. Now, normally, if you go to Timothy, you'll see that the older guys, teach the younger guys. Maybe counseling is a better word. And the older women counsel or teach the younger women. You don't normally have a pastor that's a guy take a girl that has a problem that needs counseling into his office and close the door. It's just not it's a very bad practice. You're going to get in trouble doing something like that, or someone's going to claim something happened. So the ladies take care of the ladies, guys take care of the guys. That's just common practice in First and Second Timothy. So he's asking this yoke fellow to help these two women, to counsel with them. That leads you to believe that yoke fellow might be a girl rather than a guy. Now, this word here, and I remember in seminary, yoke fellow being, they were trying to decide if it's a proper name or if it just means a yoke fellow. And it's a word in Hebrew, or Greek rather, that means someone that's you're yoked together with. So in ancient Greek, it could be a business partner, somebody in partner with ministry. It can be a spouse. It can be any kind of a close relationship. If you got a really good employee that is there for you, I mean that's a true business partner, a true person you're yoked with. You have the same spiritual attitude and want to do the same stuff in ministry or whatever. And then the other person that's just there for $5 and doesn't really care. That's not somebody that's really into the ministry with you. And this person is really dedicated to ministry. But now, in ancient Greek, like I was saying, yoke fellow, the word there in Greek means a business partner or spouse or something like that. In classical Greek and in modern Greek, it only means spouse. So let me do this. Let me just flip real quick here. This is Philippians 4:3. We run over to King James and we're going to look up this word and go over to our dictionary. Okay, so Thayer basically says it's two people yoked together in some way. So basically, it's somebody who's united in the bond of marriage or a relationship of some other kind, office, labor, study, business, or the like. It's a partner, a serious partner. I mean, even studying, you got to study and you got to get it done, and you're not going to pass the test. I mean, it's not somebody that's just kind of sort of there. It's a real dedicated partner. So it's actually a consort, a comrade, a colleague, or a partner. And so that's Thayer's in there. So basically, bond of marriage I thought was interesting. And it's from the root word, and the root word means to yoke together, which means to co-join, and usually it means, as you can see there, marriage. So that doesn't absolutely prove anything, but what we're seeing is that Clement of Alexandria and Origen both said their understanding of Philippians 4:3 is that he's saying my true yoke fellow, meaning his spouse. And I think it's interesting too, because yoke fellow would mean spouse. When you say my true yoke fellow, it's almost like saying my soulmate. This is a lady who had the same mind as Paul, not just married to him, but has got the same mind, dedicated to ministry. And Paul says, you got some ladies. I'll counsel the guys, you counsel the ladies. You got some ladies that have some problems. You know how it works. Can you fix this? This says that he didn't take her rather with him for the sake of his ministry. Remember, he kept getting killed, was gone for months or years at a time, very dangerous for what he was doing. So really interesting. And it goes on and talks about other stuff. There's an account of when Peter was executed and his wife was executed at the same time, or right before he was. So really, really interesting, some of the things you learn in church history. And then they talk about the death of John and Philip and Bishop's Simeon being martyred. Just real quick on this one, this is interesting. This actually says, let me get to this one here. Um, um, During the reign of Emperor Trajan. Okay, the above mentioned Simon, the son of Cleopas, who was the uncle of our Lord. Cleopas was the uncle. Simeon was cousin, and he became again the second bishop of Jerusalem. But this is interesting. So during the persecution time in Trajan's time, it says that he was falsely accused by heretics, and all the accused were brought before Governor Attius. Simon was tortured for many days and suffered martyrdom. Now look at this. Everyone, including the proconsul, marveled that at the age of 120 years he could endure so much. So orders were given that he should be crucified. Now we've talked about the Essene herbal medicine, and that the manuscripts, Josephus and everybody else, talks about the fact that if you eat the proper diet, exercise, all that kind of stuff, intermittent fasting, all that, but the herbal medicine that the Essenes did, the normal lifespan was 120, 110 to 120. And we've got all these different, like Menachem and several other guys in the texts and in the scriptures, even Menachem mentioned in the text, in the scriptures, of being in that kind of a category. So again, been 2,000 years, so maybe we can't quite get there. But in that day, the average lifespan of a Gentile was 60. So they literally had a double lifespan because of what they eat and what they did. And we're still trying to backwards engineer all that stuff. But here's another example of a guy who probably was in a scene. I mean, if I didn't know anything about it, but I was in the church in Jerusalem, studied under, or maybe was an associate pastor to James, and then James gets martyred and they elect me as pastor, I'm probably going to follow a lot of James's ways. And if he could eat a few herbs here and there and live twice as long, I think I'd be up for that. Now, most of us are going to say, I don't want to live to be 120. Well, I wouldn't either if the last 10, 20 years I'm bedridden. But now look at this. This guy is 120 years old, and apparently he's still employed as the pastor of the church. So that obviously he's up walking around doing stuff, maybe slowly, but then they decide to torture him. And you don't torture or even slap or even shove 100-year-old guy. You shove him and he falls down, he breaks a hip, he's dead. You know, this is a 120-year-old that you torture and he doesn't die, so you have to crucify him. That, and then you can see that's why they were amazed that there's a 120-year-old guy. And I'm sure he didn't, he looked old. But isn't that interesting? So we're getting more and more of these things. Now he's not coming out saying anything specific about the 120, the Essenes, the herbal medicine, but this is just more interesting information. Okay, anyway, one more thing I want to look at. So when we get towards the end of this, talks about Ignatius and his epistles and everything, Polycarp's epistle. So those are amazing things to read. And the last thing I wanted to look at is in the last book. Okay, so there's this guy named Papius. And there's Papius, there's Ignatius, and there's Polycarp. These are three people that were actually disciples of either John or the disciples of the apostles. So Polycarp is the guy that worked with John the apostle from Ephesus for 20 years in ministry planting churches. After his death, he becomes pastor of the church of Smyrna. Or somewhere along that line, he becomes pastor of the church of Smyrna. Ignatius was pastor of Antioch for a while and was martyred. And then Papias mentions he knew or met some of the apostles, but he wasn't a student or able to study under them specifically. But he studied under John the presbyter, Aristian, and several of the guys that knew the apostles. He writes a 5-volume work. Now, Hegesippus is another guy that writes a 5-volume work. And it's said that you could ask any possible question about the Gospels and the book of Acts and the things that happened. It would be very well answered by Hegesippus. But Papius's works and Hegesippus's works don't exist anymore. To me, that's suspicious because number one, why would you just get rid of something like that? So here's what it says here. He's a student of John. Polycarp records he had a 5-volume set. And this is what Papius says in one of his works. And again, doesn't exist anymore, but it's quoted here. Papius says, in addition to what I witnessed, I would also write down everything that I learned from the elders, that'd be the disciples of the apostles, the elders, and treasured in my memory to confirm the truth. Unlike many people, I want to hear from those who tell the truth, not fanciful stories. I do not want to hear about foreign philosophy, only those who teach what the Lord taught, the truth itself. If I met anyone who had been a disciple of the apostles anywhere, I made it a point to inquire about what they had learned from the apostles. What was taught by Andrew and Peter and Philip and Thomas and James and John and Matthew and the other disciples of our Lord? And what was taught by the elders like Aristian, John the Presbyter, and other disciples of the apostles at first century? That's the kind of people we want to talk to. So yeah, if my grandfather told me stories about sitting down and eating with Peter and Paul and John and Mary and some of the guys and girls there at that point, and what they learned from them, oh man, that'd be great. He says this: I learned more from listening to those eyewitnesses than from all the books about them in those times. That's pretty cool. And he goes on, he says, notice he mentions the name of John twice, once in the list of apostles. That'd be John the Apostle. He also lists John the Presbyter as a disciple of the apostles along with Aristian. This proves, like others record, that there were two people named John, both buried in Ephesus. So John the Apostle and this other John, one of his disciples, are buried there in Ephesus. So are Timothy and Mary, according to legend or church history. Let's see here. So most of us believe that John the Apostle is the one who saw the book of Revelation. Okay. If not, it would have been John the Presbyter. And that's why some people think it should or should not be in the canon. Depends on which John it is. Papius says he learned from the teachings of the apostles from their disciples. Specifically, he was a student of Aristian and John the Presbyter. So this is interesting here. He says he records other miracles and events that occurred he received through tradition. The daughters of Philip continued to live at Hierapolis. When Papius visited them, they told of someone who'd been raised from the dead. Another miracle occurred respecting Justus, surnamed Barsabbas, who drank a deadly poison but was not harmed by it through the grace of the Lord. This is the same Justus mentioned in the book of Acts after the resurrection, when the apostles prayed over Justus and Matthias and then cast lots to see which one of them would fill the place of Judas the traitor. So interesting. So we know very little about either one of them, but Matthias, the lot went to Matthias, so he became the person who replaced Judas. And Justus went on to do other things. And apparently he had somebody tried to poison him and it didn't work. So that's pretty interesting. Now, this is interesting. So again, we ask why are Hegesippus and Papias's records, if they could answer questions like this, why were they lost? You don't accidentally lose something like that. So somebody put them away for a reason. And this is interesting. I think this shows us what the reason is. The fact that by this time they had become amillennial. And Eusebius will record elsewhere in his work the Schism of Nepos, which is the time when the church went from being premillennial to amillennial. But notice what he says here. This is interesting. Papius was the first to write down these and other accounts from oral tradition. He also records specific, unwritten parables of our Lord with his interpretation and other incredible things. Among these is, so Papius somehow, he didn't claim to be a prophet or anything else. He just loved talking to people. And if you say you were a disciple of the apostles and you got a story to tell, man, he's writing it down. And other apostles would say, yeah, that's what happened, or no, he's a liar. So that's why everything that Papius writes is legit, right? So now he says somebody gave him unwritten parables. So in other words, parables that Jesus gave that are unwritten, not in the Gospels, and it contains Jesus' interpretation with them. So maybe it is the parables in the Gospels, and maybe the interpretation is, because we only have one parable that Jesus gave with interpretation, one or two, and then the others don't really have an interpretation, but we can kind of halfway figure it out. So at least the interpretations, if not more parables and interpretation. So he's got other things that they say are actual something of the scriptures or of Jesus. Now, it's not the Gospel of Thomas because that is considered fiction. Gospel of Mary, that kind of stuff. This is something else. And there may be a way for us to find that. But anyway, long story short, but among these, in those extra parables, among these is that the world would, or that there would rather be a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, and that Christ would physically reign on earth after the resurrection of the dead. And that's what all premillennial people believe. So that's nothing new to like us. But it says, and this is not saying anything about the rapture or even the tribulation, just that the millennial reign is yet future. He says, I assume he got his ideas from talking or from taking the apostolic account too literally. He did not understand that they were symbols that represent the mystical, not the physical. See, he's amillennial or officially in this. Now, this is interesting to me though, but so he's going great. He's the brightest guy ever, writing all this stuff down. And then he writes these one things down, and that makes him pre-mill. It's evident from his discourses that he's very limited in intelligence because he doesn't believe like us. Really interesting. His ideas are the reasons why other ecclesiastical writers held the same opinions. Specifically, the main reason is that his writings are so close to the time of the apostles. And that's how you do stuff. If all the writings, all the people that wrote anything that still exist, that knew the apostles, and if they all say the same thing, that should let you know what proper doctrine is. If there's a difference of opinion, then who knows? But if they were all premillennial, which they were, that pretty much tells you it should be premillennial. So anyway, so many early church fathers, like Irenaeus, for instance, adopted these ideas. So that is amazing. And then he goes on and talks about how he records other accounts given by Aristian and John the Presbyter mentioned above. And he gives a couple things about how the Gospels were put together and some of the things that happened. And so, again, these are things he learned. But here's my thought. If he's saying, I don't know nothing, but John the Presbyter, Aristian, this guy, that guy, the other guy, people that everybody says are legit, Polycarp, Ignatius, I talked to all of them, and they all agreed that this happened this way. Here's the books, here's what's good, and this is why. And so I'm just writing all this stuff down. I don't know, I wasn't there. I'm just writing everything down that they say. So he's going to look at this and say Papius is the greatest thing ever because he's got so much information. Except apparently he got confused and thought premillennialism instead of amillennialism because he is of limited intelligence, except he's so smart. It's just, okay, this is interesting. So he does this in a couple other places in his book when he's talking about that. For instance, when he talks about the schism of Nepos, he'll talk about everybody knows we're all millennial. And then he says, but the schism of Nepos is where it switched. If we're all millennial and we've always been that way, what do you mean when we switched? Well, so to me, he's either doing the party line. This is what we officially teach now. But here's all the text that kind of sort of shows something a little different. Or somebody rewrote something or something. It's just interesting for me to see this. This brilliant guy is brilliant except for the fact he's a premillennial guy. And he must have been confused. So he didn't maybe get confused on anything else. Remember, he didn't come up with the ideas. He's just writing down what they told him. So if he's the one that caused the problem for us to start thinking pre-mill when we shouldn't, where did he get the idea from? And why didn't John the Presbyter, Aristian, John the Apostle, maybe still alive, Polycarp, Ignatius, why didn't any of these other guys go, oh, no, you got this backwards? It's just interesting. So anyway, if you pull that together, it looks like from this, the reason certain people like Hagesippus and Papius, their stuff is put aside, is because they explain things so well, the medieval church considered it too dangerous to have and made sure it was disappeared. And I'm not normally a conspiracy theory person, but when you see this, it's like, and you have some corroborating evidence of that too. In where was it? Irenaeus wrote, and then Hippolytus wrote some stuff. And Hippolytus is referred to as an anti-pope, which, not that he's a bad guy or good guy or anything, but he's somebody that would have been pope had someone else not stepped in and taken it, and there would have been like a re-election, except the persecution comes and they all get killed. So nobody knows what happened. But in his text, he actually mentions that there is a bishop of Rome, Callistus, I believe it was, who deliberately created a group of people that are non-Trinitarian, and he didn't care what you believed. He just simply said, invoke some anger and some thought, so they'll tithe to you. I'll say how bad you are, so they'll tithe to me, and we'll both make money. And I'll let this go if you give me 10% of what you get from the other side. So this is just a way to kind of control the people and make lots of money. So that's Hippolytus's account of Callistus. I think it was Callistus, one of the bishops of Rome at the time. So again, that to me sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's just like that's a little too weird. But here you got a church father saying, I was there, I heard it, this is what happened. Okay, interesting. So now you've got the same kind of thing. It's like Papius and Hagesippus, greatest things ever. Well, then where are they? Well, we lost them. Okay. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So to me, this leads to the idea that the reason they were set aside is that they were premillennial. There may be other things too, but it's really, really interesting. So this is one of the reasons why we want to study church history, and just know everything, put everything together. And like we said, when we looked at Paul's wife, the idea would be then to go through all of the church fathers that exist. There's not that many. Did anybody ever say anything other than, that Paul didn't have a wife or something like that? Or did anybody leave a commentary on Philippians 4:3 and say yoke fellow is some guy that lives over here, or any more information or contradictory information? So that's basically how you would pull it all together. So we're going to go ahead and stop here at this point, and I'll go into the chat room, see if there's any questions. but I wanted to share a few things with you on this. We'll eventually put this together in book form too, but the epistles of Ignatius, the epistle of Polycarp, the Didache, Eusebius's basic church history. Those are things we need to have a little bit of information on, just kind of help us with understanding things. This who a lot of the guys were. So, all right, let's go into the chat room and see if we have questions. We have a few. I've been trying to find your teachings on Out of the Midst. I see several other teachers on it, but I would appreciate your series. How can I find it? Trying to think if that would be, let me see if I can find, let me try this here. Go to YouTube. I think it should be on YouTube, but let's find out. And here, actually, if I had it, it'd be in the Rapture playlist up here. It may be on our network, but it should be on both. Rapture studies. Okay. Oh, I'm talking. Go away. All right, let's see. Pre-trib. Okay, pre-trib. I would think it would be the restrainer. Let me just see here real quick. And let me do that. See if there's anything in here. Yeah, Out of the Midst. There it is. So it's in the pre-trib rapture series. It's called the restrainer of the Antichrist, is where we talk about the phrase out of the midst. And for anybody out there that doesn't know about it, Paul uses the phrase in 2 Thessalonians about the Antichrist will be revealed, but when the Antichrist is revealed, it's the restrainer that's holding him back. And it says a couple different things, but in Greek, it actually says when the restrainer, whatever, whoever that is taken out of the midst. And we have a commentary, church father, again, church history is cool, a commentary on the book of Revelation by a guy named Victor, about 240 AD or something, that quotes this and says, the coming out of the midst is the church leaving the planet. So it's the rapture of the church. And then we go back and see how there's other things like Enoch was taken out of the midst. I think Elijah was taken out of the midst. There's 2 or 3 other things like that. And we know they were raptured. It's a type of rapture. So we find out then by looking at all these things, coming out of the midst is an idiom for a rapture. And that makes sense because when Paul says when the restrainer comes out of the midst, that's when it happens. He would only say it like that if he expected you to know what the restrainer is and what coming out of a midst is. It has to mean a specific thing. If I said, I'll see you on Christmas, I'm assuming you know that Christmas is December 25th on our calendar. If you don't know that, then I'll never see you. But I'm expecting that you know that. So when you have an odd thing like that, it's got to be because it's an idiom, and you got to find the meaning to the idiom. So anyway, it's right here. Our YouTube, Pre-Trib Rapture Studies, Restrainer of the Antichrist talks about that. So, okay, good question. Okay, next question. Much easier not to It's much easier not to type little Apocalypse of Elijah. Any relation to some of the apocalyptic literature that was present during the 1st century? Oh, yeah, I know I've looked at it before, but there's a lot of that kind of stuff. Apocalypse of Elijah, I don't remember it being legitimate, but there's quite a bit of apocalyptic literature outside the canon, and 90% of it is just fiction. Like, for instance, like I say, somebody could have a memory of something Jesus did when he was a kid and wrote it down somewhere. But as far as a full-blown gospel, there's only 4. So if that's the case, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, those kind of things would be fiction, which is what the church fathers say. Now, again, the church fathers are not authoritative, but if they were eyewitnesses and all basically said the same thing, it would kind of make sense. Do you think the Nephilim demons are angry that they were born into a non-redeemable state of no fault of their own? Very well could be. Um, I know the standard teaching is that the Nephilim could not repent and that they would never rise, meaning, and that can be interpreted as won't couldn't be forgiven and get in the resurrection like we are. We were born with a sin nature, and it's not our fault. At least you and me, anyway. It's not our fault. It's we inherited it from Adam and Eve. Um, so that's one thing. They're kind of in the same boat, which kind of makes me wonder. But just like you have places in like Ecclesiastes and places that say that the dead don't rise, and it's a lot of people, some of the cults will take that and say, see, that means there's no physical resurrection. What it's actually saying is that if you wipe out an entire group of people, like you have an enemy like the Canaanites, you always trying to kill off the Israelis. Once the Canaanites are completely exterminated, they're never going to come back and attack again because they don't exist. The entire race is wiped out. And I think that's what we're talking about with the Nephilim. The Nephilim as a race never come back to attack because they were all wiped out and or killed. The ones that are actually dead anyway are dead. And I know there's some rumors that maybe not all the Nephilim died. So, and I understand that there should be some. There definitely were post-flood Nephilim, but that's a whole other story. We actually have some history on that kind of stuff. But it makes you wonder. I'm sure the Lord, being who He is, would say if they repent, that would be fine. Um, Maybe none of them repented, but I'm thinking of Ruth the Moabitess, who became a believer, and other people like that. There's the Moabite guy that was Solomon's shepherd in Gad chapter 3 or 5, something like that, who wanted to convert. And so there are others that are believers. So it's an interesting thing, but I'm not absolutely sure that none of them could be redeemed or that they could or could not, because it depends on how you look at those words. But yeah, I would think they would be upset at that. But ultimately, God's in control and God knows what's best. So God will make that decision. The decision was that they were to be slaughtered, all the bodies destroyed, and that their spirits would roam the earth. And that caused too much of a problem. And after Noah had asked, 9/10 of them were chained up until the time we see in, I think, Revelation chapter 9, when they're released. So it's an interesting thought. That's a good question. Was Philippians written after Corinthians? I'm trying to reconcile him being married with what is said in 1 Corinthians 7:8. Um, Other people have asked that, and it's interesting. He's either saying, I think that's the one where he says, I'd rather you be like I am because of the upcoming problem. And he could be saying, I'd rather you be single like I am because of the upcoming problem. They try to torture your kids and your wife in front of you. And if you don't have any, then you're better off. So for an upcoming persecution, that would be better. But like it said there, he had a wife and he never took her with him because of the dangers of ministry. So in that case, he could be saying, I wish you were like I am. And right now I'm celibate because my wife is not here because there's no way I would bring her down here. Um, so knowing how to be married, how to not be married, how to be abound and not abound. So it could be either one. So again, it's an interesting thing. A lot of these things, when you look at them, see, because if that made it very clear he was never married, the church father would have to be wrong. And so if the church father's right and that says what it says, is there a possibility they could both be right? And Yeah, the timing might be a different thing too. Maybe she did die at the point, but we'd have to look at that and see. I'm not sure about the timing of Corinthians and Philippians. I think I have that somewhere. It should be fairly easy to look up, though, and find out. Was Polycarp burned at the stake? Yes. Seems like that's what Ken Connolly had said, the story in the English Bible. Yes, there's actually two texts in the Church Fathers, the archive. One is the martyrdom of Polycarp, which talks about his end and how he went and they burned him at the stake. And then there is an epistle that he wrote to the Church of Philadelphia. Is it Philadelphia? Philippi. Yeah, it's close. Anyway, the epistle is really interesting. I know a lot of us like to read Fox's Book of Martyrs, and in there they will have most of those, like all the martyrdoms that they went through, and that does help us to teach, or helps teach us how to be consistent, how to be virtuous, and go forward in the face of fear. But their texts that they wrote, I think, are much more valuable. So, if you want to do that, read the Martyrdom of Polycarp, but also read his epistle. His epistle is pretty cool. And I think we have a modern English translation of that on our network. Do you think demons are soulless? I really don't know. I'm not sure what a soul is. Um, the scripture talks about us having a body, soul, and spirit. So obviously they're three separate things, and each one of us has all three of them. Um, if demons were created like us, it's hard to tell. I would assume an angel would have a body, spirit, and a soul, or something like that. They were definitely physical, and they definitely had a mind. They definitely had a spirit because their spirits are, that's what the demons are. So if they had a physical body, they have a spirit. Do they have a soul? That's a good question. And depending on what a soul is, that might explain why they could or could not be forgiven or resurrected. So it's I've wondered about that a lot. Several of the guys, most of us believe that we have a body, soul, and spirit. There were some of the early, not really early, semi-early church fathers that believed in what was called traducianism, that the soul and the spirit are the same thing, and then we only have two pieces to us. And they, of course, they also taught that both the body and the soul come from the father and the mother rather than coming from God. So most of us do not believe that. I don't believe that, but it's interesting to look at. So yeah, we'd have to go back and figure out exactly what a soul is, and I think that's kind of hard to do. Has been for me anyway. In Psalm 69, which Jesus quotes in verse 4 of John 15, the Dead Sea Scroll has a title that doesn't appear in the Bible. It says, "To the chief musician, to the tune of the lilies" by David. What is this referring to? Well, we're not sure of a lot of that stuff. A lot of times it'll tell us this a certain stringed instrument to play, and then it's to a certain tune, and then it's also to um, you know a beat or something like that. It all depends on what it says. The tune of the lilies. The word for lily can also be trumpet. So that lets a lot of people think that that could actually be, or Psalm 69 would be prophetic. And there's other things that are, go along with the prophecies too. As far as the tune of the lilies or the song of the lilies, I don't know that we actually have that stuff recorded anywhere. It's definitely not in scripture. We have a lot of extra biblical songs and psalms in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and references to a lot of them, but I'm not sure what that is. It'd be interesting to look at. I mean, just from a prophecy standpoint, if two things were set to the same tune, are they both prophetic? And what would the tune sound like? That would be really cool to see all that stuff. When will this book be ready to purchase? This one, I'm not sure. It's going to take me a while. There are 10 volumes to his church history, and we've got volumes 1 and 2 done. This is 3. I'm just now finishing it up and everything, so it's going to be a while to get all 10 of them done. But I wanted to kind of show you some of the stuff that's out there. Now, if you have, won't be my version, of course, but if you have eSword, let me just pull that up again real quick. And you go to here, you can have, like, I've got Josephus, and there are, I don't have it on here. Okay, anyway, the ante-Nicene fathers are what we were talking about, is everything pre-Nicaea. You can also get the post-Nicene fathers, and the very first volume is Eusebius. It's pretty cool too, because Eusebius did such a great job with uh, the time of Jesus up to 325. The next 3 books are church history books by Sozomen, Theodore, and Socrates, and they all start their history books by saying Eusebius did such a great job. We're just going to start at 325 and go forward. So it's really interesting to see that, but you can actually get that in here and in other places too, Eusebius. Um, so hopefully, we'll get that done in the near future. Do you believe that John the Apostle and John the Presbyter are the same person? Apparently, no, they were not. Um, why did some think they're 2 different people? How did Irenaeus see John unless John was super old at that point? Yeah, John, according to what they said, the Apostle John was in the Isle of Patmos during Domitian's persecution that lasted a little less than a year. So that's 96 AD. After that, he was released, went back to Ephesus, and worked with Polycarp for, it says, a little more than 20 years. So that would put us at 96, 06, 16, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, they say that John died during the reign of Trajan. Trajan was Caesar from 98 AD to 117. And I think there's one place in here that Eusebius says it was in the latter half of the reign. So John died somewhere between 107 to 117 AD. So again, he made it up there. Now, if he was a scene like Simeon, living to be about 120, that's really easy to do, actually. And then dying and being buried in Ephesus. If he was a normal person, that would not be possible. If he died at 60, for instance. So yeah, so they talk about John the Presbyter as being a different John, and I maybe we didn't read it in here, but he mentions that there's 2 Johns. They're both buried in Ephesus. So John the Presbyter, I think Ariston and Polycarp were disciples of John the Apostle. Polycarp, I'm not sure where he's buried, but John the Apostle, John the Presbyter, Timothy, and Mary, Jesus' mom, are supposed to all be married in Ephesus. And then, yeah, super old. That's definitely the case. So Irenaeus has this comment about when he was a child. He studied under Polycarp and stuff like that, but occasionally would check with the other. So Irenaeus is writing at 170, more or less. If John died, just say in the last, say like 110. So if he was at 170, if he was 70 or 80 years old, he would have been a kid and occasionally could have seen John. So it's a possibility. And it's interesting to me, though, because a lot of people will look at this and say, well, the numbers don't mesh. It's like, but if someone said he was an eyewitness and you say he's got to be over here, then you've got to move this one. So a lot of times it's hard to figure out exactly where those numbers go. Do you think the very large structures found throughout the earth were built by giants? The megalithic stuff, it definitely looks like it. Um, like I say, I normally wouldn't go that direction because I don't know how they people would build them. But yeah, it's pretty interesting since we have the Bible telling us the Genesis 6 story, And then after the flood, we have the other giants, and then the scrolls and the other things tell us all the history of the pre-flood giants, the post-flood giants, where they were at, who they did, and all that stuff, or a good amount of the history. Um, and then you have all of these megalithic structures, I mean, all over. So yeah, there's got to be something to that. And some of those things, I remember, um, I mean, even 5 tons or 10 tons would be almost impossible for even a group of people to move without um, some heavy equipment. But I think, if I remember, the slabs like the stones at Baalbek, I think were like 100 tons. And I think there is if I remember correctly, there is a wall structure somewhere in Russia that someone found, and it's like a wall with big stones, but each stone is somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 tons. And it's the same kind of stuff. It's like they're all put together perfectly. You couldn't put a piece of paper through the crack. They're all completely sealed. So, yeah, it definitely looks like there's something interesting there. That would make sense that as far as a flood goes, it would wipe everything out, including maybe animals, animal bones, writings, almost everything, unless it's buried under something like that. So it's interesting. L.A. Marzulli has an entire series uh, what is that called? On the Trail of the Nephilim. And my son and I on Sunday nights are going through that. We just got through number 4, which has some really interesting things. There's a lot of archaeology around that people just don't talk about it, but there's really no way around it saying what it is. So very interesting, especially since the scrolls talk about the information coming back in the end times. They give you a brief analysis of how to create Nephilim. And so when you read that, it's obviously DNA manipulation, but there's no way they would have known about the DNA back then. And when you write a work of fiction and then 100 years of science goes by, it's obvious it's fiction because you can't know everything. And if you did know, there's something supernatural about that. Let's see here. Any chance Paul was betrothed but not technically married? Yeah, that's a possibility. In the Jewish mindset, you could be betrothed at birth, a prearranged marriage. And the basic idea is if he would have grown up, for instance, and she would have decided that she didn't like him or he didn't like her, or one set of parents realized that they were turned out to be a really bad person, then the marriage would be not nullified but broken up. And since it was a prearranged legal marriage, you would have to actually get a divorce. That's just what they called it, rather than a uh, dissolving the marriage. There's a word for it, but so yes, that's a definite possibility. And so in some people's minds, he would technically be married, but he would have never been married. So that's a possibility too. And then someone else pointed out too, if he was up to be part of the Sanhedrin, or a priest, well, he couldn't have been a priest because he was Benjamite, but if he was part of the Sanhedrin, I think all those are required to be married. So maybe not, but it's interesting. Could there be a correlation between the right knot of Revelation 10, John, 2nd John 1:12, and 3rd John 1:13? Could there be a riddle in Greek that explains having many things to write, I decided not to write? That's possible, especially if they come like if it's the same phrase in all 3 of those. It would be interesting to look at because there's a lot of things like that. Like the person that was just asking about the out of the midst. That's something that we don't normally see, and it's actually only, as far as I know, it's only in Scripture once. But we got a church father telling us it's an idiom that means a rapture. And then you've got 2 other people, 2 other manuscripts using it to refer to Enoch and Elijah's rapture, where they were changed and caught up as being out of the midst. So you've got a good amount of evidence to show that it actually has a meaning. So if we could find someone saying something about that having a certain idiom, I think that's the key to everything, because a lot of times when we read this stuff, you can translate it from Greek into English 20 different ways. Abraham went down to Egypt. He walked down to Egypt. He rode down to Egypt. He came to Egypt. He went to Egypt. He was going to, you could say it a dozen different ways and it all has the same meaning. But the idioms, that really makes a big, big difference in these things. I would like to, if you find anything out like that, or I'll try to look too and see if there's anything, but that would be really interesting to see. Because if there is an idiom, that really could mean a couple things. This is off topic. I'm new here. Well, thank you for joining us. But I wanted to know if celebrating the Sabbath on Saturday, per the Bible, is required of Christians today, as it is part of the Ten Commandments. No, it's not. It's a ceremonial event. And the Bible in Genesis talks about the fact that we all should observe the Sabbath. And by that, it's meaning a calendar system that has a 7-day week cycle. And there's a big discussion in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Essene calendar, the Pharisee calendar, and we go by a Gregorian calendar. So we need to know God's calendar in order to understand the things that happen and the prophecies and things like that. But as far as us doing a ritual on the Sabbath, that's not something that we do. We should always take at least one day out of 7 to rest. Most of us take 2, a Saturday and a Sunday. But and we definitely need to go to church and study. The pattern we found out from the scrolls is that on the Sabbath it's a rest day, and you do go to the synagogue if there, or the temple, if there is a ritual that's being performed. And then on the first day of the week, some people just went to work. Other people, if you were serious about your religion, would have a rabbi, and that's when the in-depth teaching would be. So there's like at least one day of in-depth Bible teaching going on with you and your rabbi. So they always had a Saturday and a Sunday type thing. But the Sabbath, which is Friday night to Saturday night, is always geared toward rituals. And a lot of the rituals originally, when you look at Leviticus, are basically for the priestly class. So there's a lot of confusion on that kind of stuff. Like for instance, the kosher food. It talks about it has to be kosher, and then it says that everything has to be kosher in the holy city, which would be Jerusalem. And then when you go back to your own cities in Israel, you eat whatever you want, like the roe and the hart and things like that. Now, those are clean animals, but if you shoot them with a bow and arrow, they become unkosher. But the basic idea is you're not in Jerusalem and you're not a priest, so it doesn't really matter. So there's a lot of interesting things like that. If you're a Gentile, according to the law, it's not mandatory that you observe a Sabbath. But most of the time you're going to be working with Jews or for Jews, so you kind of have to observe the Sabbath anyway, or you're going to mess them up. But yeah, it's a very specific thing. We need to observe the concept. We need to have a day of rest. We need to observe a 7-day cycle, and we need to understand the calendar in depth. But we don't do the rituals. And that's what I always thought was funny, because the Seventh day Adventists will say it's absolutely necessary for you to observe the Sabbath. Okay. So if you're going to observe the Sabbath, you're going to put on the cloth, you're going to have the 2 candles, you're going to say the proper prayers in Hebrew, you got to do it the right way. And that's observing the Sabbath, is going through a ritual. I mean, even us as Christians, we do a communion. And Paul says if you do the communion wrong, that's why some of you are dead. You're doing the ritual wrong. Don't mess up the ritual. And so, again, you're not supposed to do those things. It's actually forbidden for a Gentile to do a Sabbath type thing, or a Passover, or those kind of things. You can be with a Jewish family that's doing it, but for you to do it yourself makes changes in the ritual, and that's supposed to be the akin of creating your own religion. which is forbidden. So it's really interesting to see all that. But a lot of times we get confused. There were people in the first century that taught that all Christians have to observe all the ceremonial laws, and they were called party of the circumcision. And so sometimes that refers to Jews, but sometimes it's referring to a specific Christian sect that is trying to be Jewish. And it's just basically the fact that there's a culture that has things to do. It's much like today you could be a Muslim that forgets about Sharia law, and you come to America, for instance, and follow the Constitution. Then that would be acceptable. But if you're going to push Sharia law, that's not something we do over here, and it's not a good law system to have anyway. And so the same kind of stuff. The Jews, the ancient Jews, went by the law of Moses. Modern day Jews do not go by at least the entire law of Moses. So yeah, so far all together, basically, it's not required of Christians. We do need to go to church. Normally over here we go to church on Sunday morning, which is keeping that other part of the tradition. But it doesn't matter. If you want to go to a Messianic synagogue and hang out with Jewish believers, they would do that on a Saturday, of course. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. But just when you say that Gentiles should do something that used to be forbidden is the problem. And some people do that, but most don't. If you go to a Messianic synagogue or even a normal Israeli synagogue or talk to Jews, they will tell you this is for Jews only. And I believe, according to the scrolls, it's actually supposed to be for priests only. But there's lots of examples in that. So, like Deuteronomy 14:21, for instance, tells you very clearly that the Gentiles ate non kosher food even while living with Israelis in Israeli cities, even though Israelis did not eat non kosher food. So, anyway, there's lots of stuff like that. That's a really great question, though. So, the main thing is we don't want to divide over it. And it's always good to study because you're able to see things by observing a ritual. I still like to go to Messianic synagogues and during Yom Kippur and Passover and things like that to look at the ritual again and just remember things. And you do learn quite a bit. What scroll has the Nephilim recipe? It's called the Book of Giants, and it basically talks about how they created what they call unstable life forms. It talks about, well, you know how if you mix a donkey and a horse together, you get a mule. And most of the time, mules are sterile. And most people think it's always sterile, and that's not the case. Sometimes they're not, they can reproduce. So their whole concept was, and they gave examples of taking 200 horses and 200 donkeys and creating 200 unstable life forms, out of which there'd at least be a handful that could reproduce. And they talked about sheep and goats, same thing. Certain things do mate together, but it's unstable. And that's all they said. Now, today we understand that there's a chromosome count of one and a chromosome count of another. And if you can mate them together, the chromosome count of the sheep goat creature or the mule would be like in between the two. And so, this idea of creating an unstable life form, and if you know what you're doing, you can mix and match the right forms at the right times and actually get a creature out of it. And that's how we had the Nephilim stuff. Now, what to me is interesting is in the Middle Ages, they had formulas for stuff like that. Like you take two rocks and throw in some seawater and do something, and it just works. And of course, that's all a bunch of bull. There's no way that would work. But it's interesting to look at the scrolls and say, well, if you did that, that's probably a low tech version of test tube babies and stuff like that. So that actually could work. So it's interesting that in the stories that they give, there's nothing that modern science would say, oh, no, there's no way that would work. They would actually say, yeah, it's pretty accurate. So it's really interesting, but it's called the Book of Giants. Our Book of Enoch has the Book of Giants in the back. The Book of Enoch's pretty large. The Book of Giants is probably like 3 or 4 pages, and that's it. Just a real small thing. So we've got it in the back of that. Off topic, but what is the connection with ancient pyramids, megaliths, and modern day sorcery and witchcraft, pagan religions, and channeling or attempting to contact other dimensions? I think it basically stems from paganism in general. And paganism is a group of people that know something's important, they have no clue what it is, so they make up a story. And so, for instance, the Nephilim idea of crossbreeding animals to create a new life form comes into the medieval mind as incubus and succubus and things like that. And so it's interesting to me, like they'll say that certain holidays are pagan, and there may be some pagan aspects to it, but maybe not. And they kind of mix things around like that. And so this whole concept, the modern day sorcery or the modern day occultic type stuff, is that if you contact a spirit or do a ritual just right, you can open a portal to another dimension. And there are things like that in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 10. I think it's Deuteronomy 10. Talks about the Canaanite versions of things, and there's one who has a familiar spirit, and that's someone who draws a circle on the ground and conjures up a spirit. And so that kind of sounds like a portal or a doorway into another dimension kind of thing. And so a lot of these people now are trying to explain occultism with scientific terms. And I think it's amazing because you can always do that. I can take something that seems absolutely foolish and explain it away with scientific terms, and it sounds probable. Or something that is totally immoral and you would never accept, but I'll use psychological terms, make up new terms for these things. He's not sinning, he's not a bad guy, he has this whatever disorder. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, that's different. So Satan has always tried to, in each generation, change the terms so that we think it's something else. And I think that's pretty much it. The ancient pyramids, the modern day megaliths, those kind of things, I think, are Nephilim technology, which is demonic, or it has, in a sense, it's partially demonic. But then the pagans come along and then make up stories to fill in the gaps. Like, for instance, the idea is like Halloween is the time when the veil between the worlds are the thinnest. So if I was going to try to conjure a spirit, it probably wouldn't work. But if I did it at Halloween, it actually might work because it's just easier at that point. And why would that be? Why would Halloween or any particular day be easier than some other day? Well, it comes back to what Halloween is for. And if it's a memory of the flood, then that's the Day of the Dead, the day the dead were all destroyed. It makes sense that in an occult way would be the time to contact them, the death date. That's what the old paganism, the old teraphim type stuff was. You take your firstborn son, sacrifice him in a certain way, and then on the date, the anniversary, and I don't know what calendar they'd be using, of his death is when you would, as long as you maintained possession of his skull, you could conjure the spirit back, send messages back and forth, and that kind of stuff. And so it's just like that in itself, I think, is a garbled text of something else. So it just seems like you have these medieval myths, and if you go further back 1,000 years or two, pieces of it are there, but it's a different story, a different form. And then you go on back. And I would probably say it's all myth, except we have that in the Bible. We have giants, we have demons, we have unclean spirits, things like that, angels. So they have to be real. So, yeah, so I think part of it is an attempt to make it sound scientific, and part of it is the pagan stuff of trying to figure out the missing pieces of the story and then just adding it together. Good question. There's a lot of interesting things like that. And let's see, our last question is, Are these megaliths and pyramids portals, like the one at CERN, demonic in nature? Again, I'm not sure. It seems like most of the megaliths had something to do with human sacrifice or genetic manipulation, things like that. Um, this last Sunday, I was watching, I think it was number 4, but one of L.A. Marzulli's videos on the Trail of the Nephilim, and they were talking about American Stonehenge, which is I forget where it's up. It's back east somewhere. But the slab that looks like it was for sacrificing is like a 9,000 pounds, like 4.5 tons or 4 tons or something like that. And there's no way that humans of any kind at any number could create something like that and place it on top. And, so something is important. They were saying that they do have equipment now that could have equipment cranes that could actually move that, but to get a crane in there in position to do it would not be possible without destroying something else. So again, we still couldn't quite do that kind of stuff. But what I was noticing is they have all through the Americas, they have places where it's a slab that's big enough to put a human on or another animal. And if you sacrifice it, there's going to be a lot of blood. So these things will have a trough around them and then one little place where the liquid would empty out. So you could actually kill your whatever you're killing, sacrificing, and you could catch all the blood in some sort of a cup or basin or something because it would all go and drain down one point. And what I thought was interesting was one of that was looking at the Stonehenge, American Stonehenge, and the guy was talking on the video saying that about 80 miles south of there or away from there, someone had found another monolith, a big stone, not nearly as big, in a farm field. And he was wanting to move it over, get rid of it to farm. So he managed to flip it over or knock it over or whatever. On the other side, though, is this carving. And it was like a human being sacrificed or something, and in the same kind of shape. And so they connected that with the Stonehenge site because it looks the same. And I thought it was really interesting, but they drew the attention to the fact that the arms of the person are straight down and the legs of the person are spread open. So at first you might be thinking like probably what they would do in the Middle Ages is a sexual assault and then a murder. But if we forget about that's what pagans would do because they don't understand the story. If we remember the Nephilim creations, the Book of Giants, how you crossbreed, stuff like that, it might actually be part of a slab where people or beings or animals would give birth and catch the fluid or blood or whatever that way. Because it doesn't seem like they're tied, like if you draw and quarter someone, but it's halfway that way. Lots of speculation on why it would be drawn that way, but if you're just plugging everything in with the old text about the genetic manipulation, it comes out pretty interesting. So I don't know. There's a lot of stuff like that, and not just that, but there's a lot of text that look like it might be partially pre-flood language, a lot of Hebrew, a lot of Phoenician, and other types of things scattered all around in different places. There's some in Kentucky, some in Tennessee, some in Nevada. Just all around, there's things like that. Whether or not they could actually open a portal, I would be skeptical about that. But then again, the whole idea of the Obi in Deuteronomy 10, I believe it is, and that's in King James, it says it's one who has a familiar spirit. And the idea is that they would have a teraphim, the skull thing we talked about, and use that to control the spirit, and they would draw a circle on the ground and do that. And Wiccans and things like that, other groups like that will draw circles on the ground. And so again, what makes it interesting is the Wiccans would do that and have one story of how it works, would not have any memory of genetic manipulation. but you'd have that over here. So again, that just shows that the pagans have a memory of something that happened, but they're filling in the gaps as they go along. So a lot of the stuff is fiction, but it's based on something that happened a long time ago. Okay, well, it looks like that's all of our questions. So I thought this was interesting, just looking at church history, and there's a lot of little things like that we can look at that really help answer some questions. One another couple things in Eusebius was the two people in Acts that tried to attack Jerusalem, and even when Paul was before one of the Romans, he said, "Are you that guy that was had the group of people that were trying to attack ways back?" And so Eusebius will mention who they were, what families they were from, what they were doing, things like that. Lots and lots of information. So, okay, we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. We'll be back for a teaching and a Q&A next Monday. God bless you guys, and we'll see you then.